Hello everyone. So recently there was an update to Magic Arena in which Historic Anthologies 3 came out. So basically what Historic Anthology is basically they take a curated set of cards from the past that they presume will be good to add to Arena for gameplay purposes or nostalgic purposes. Hard to know for sure. They don't really communicate that, but with the latest Historic Anthologies release, there was some pretty interesting cards in there. One very interesting card in there was Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. So this is one of the Ulamog cards that have existed in the past, and this is the one from Battle for Zendikar, I believe. And basically, Ulamog, both forms of Ulamog are considered very, very strong cards. This one in particular, what it does, it's a legendary creature, Eldrazi. Costs 10 generic mana to cast, so of any color, as you can see. And whenever you cast Ulamog Ceaseless Hunger, exile 2 target permanents. So that is relevant, not necessarily in this deck. It also has Indestructible, which obviously is a very strong keyword. And then the big payoff is whenever it attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards from their library. He's also 10/10. So basically this deck I am going to show you is basically a re-animator strategy, loosely based along Ulamog. There's been re-animator decks in the past that have focused around, Drakuseth, but there hasn't really been another really good re-animator target, in my opinion, in quite a while, and probably that exists in Historic and Arena. It used to be that you would also have Villas, Broker of Blood, as a target, but I don't really feel like he's the best re-animator target, because generally the turn you reanimate him, assuming it's early enough in the game, like turn 4, turn 5, you don't really have mana in which to activate his activatable ability, which is kind of what makes him strong. So with Ulamog, I figured maybe it was time to relook at the strategy, as I'm sure many people were thinking. So this is the shell I came up with. Basically, it's a pretty common self-mill re-animator shell with a couple tweaks. So I think any self-mill strategy has to run 4 Stitcher Suppliers if you can. If you don't know what Stitcher Supplier does, basically it's a 1 mana 1/1, and when it enters the battlefield or dies, you put the top 3 cards of your library to your graveyard. So basically, best case scenario, 1 mana, you're putting the top 6 cards of your graveyard into your library, and you also have a blocker, so obviously a very good card for these kinds of strategies. An issue I sometimes run into with re-animator strategies in particular is what happens if you draw the card you're trying to reanimate. So something like Drakuseth or Ulamog are obviously very, very hard to cast. Ulamog, well, they both cost a lot of mana, and Drakuseth has 3 red pips in its mana cost, so that is obviously very challenging to cast at any sort of good point in the game. So what I did to combat that is I went to Rakdos in colors, black, red, because red generally has cards that are fairly good at discarding your own cards to draw back cards. So recently in Ikoria, they reintroduced Cathartic Reunion, which is another older card, and this is a great card because it basically allows you to pseudo self-mill. So if you don't know what it is, it's a sorcery for 2 mana, and then an additional cost to cast the spell, which is important because sometimes it makes so you can't cast it, but it's an additional cost to cast the spell. You discard 2 cards, then you draw 3 cards. So sometimes what can happen is you can, draw a reanimator target, or maybe you haven't drawn into a reanimator spell. Cathartic Reunion can help you out a lot there, so you don't just have, dead cards in hand. Corpse Churn is a newer card. That's an instant, and it says put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then you may return a creature card from your hand, from the graveyard to your hand. Sorry. This card I like a lot. First, it's an instant for only 2 mana, and it puts 3 cards into your graveyard, but it also combos really well with Stitcher Supplier. So if you can somehow get Stitcher Supplier to die, it has now milled 6 cards on Stitcher Supplier, then you Corpse Churn back out the Stitcher Supplier. That's 9 cards in, and then you can replay the Stitcher Supplier, now you're 12 cards in. If it dies again, now you're 15 cards in. So it can really start to add up very quickly. It also kind of doubles as, if things do happen to go late, you can just grab a bigger creature back from the graveyard if you really need to do that. Kroxa, Titan Death's Hunger, obviously this is a very powerful card. It kind of runs 2 purposes in this deck. So obviously the 2 mana cost, when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it escapes. So for 2 mana, you have to sacrifice it once it comes in, which puts it in the graveyard, which is where you want your big stuff to be. And also, when it enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card, and then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. So basically, it forces them to discard and potentially lose life as well, which can slow them down and allow you to get to your strategy, your re-animator strategy. And also he has a way of reanimating himself, and he's also a pretty decent reanimating target himself because he's a 6/6, and when he attacks, that happens. So he kind of serves a dual purpose in this deck. Brixmati Reveler is kind of a late include I did, but it makes a lot of sense actually because it's a 2 mana 2/2, which is fine. It's a fine blocker. It can get in the way. It can slow them down a bit. But it also, when it enters the battlefield, by default, you can discard a card and then draw a card. So once again, this kind of serves to fix the purpose of, what if I draw a Drakuseth, or what if I draw an Ulamog? It's no longer dead in my hand. I can discard it and then draw a card in place of it, which is great. You can also, if need be, if the game goes this long, you can also pay its spectacle cost, in which case you can discard your whole hand. So say you have multiple targets in your hand, and then you draw 3 more, or say you only have an Ulamog left in your hand and a Rixmati, you spectacle it, you discard your Ulamog, and then draw 3 cards, which is fantastic. So now we're going to go on to basically the re-animator spells in the deck. So it's a little hard to come up with an exact number of each of these to run. They all kind of have their own purpose. The first one being Blood for Bones. So this is a great card because it's only 4 mana. It's also a sorcery, and what it says is basically as an additional cost to cast the spell, sacrifice a creature. So you have to have a creature on board to run this, but it synergizes really well with Stitcher Supplier because obviously Stitcher Supplier wants to be sacrificed anyways, and then after you sacrifice a creature, you return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield, so re-animate, and then you return another creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it combos real well with Stitcher Supplier. So you can sack Stitcher Supplier, get it back to your hand, reanimate an Ulamog, yada yada yada. You get it. That's basically why this card's really good. The big downside of it is if you don't have creatures on board, then yeah, it can't really be played. So something to keep in mind. I'm still kind of tweaking around my reanimator spells. I'm not sure I have it exactly right, but this is what I'm going with for now. The next one is probably the most powerful reanimator spell in standard right now, or in arena right now, I should say. This is a historic deck, it's not a standard deck, but it's called Bond of Revival. It's 5 mana, 1 black sorcery, and it says return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste until your next turn. So basically you can bring something back and swing with it immediately. Obviously our 2 main reanimator targets kind of need to attack to really do their thing. So this on turn 5 can just bring something out of the graveyard out of nowhere and activate its ability on an attack, which is great. Cauldron's Gift is only okay. It's obviously not as good as Bond of Revival, but it does have kind of a dual purpose. If there was better re-animator spells, I don't know if I would be running this, but I figured I needed a mass of them so I can always have one available, hopefully on, you know, turn 4 or turn 5 when I have mana. But basically, Cauldron's Gift is a sorcery for 5 mana. It has Adamant, so if 3 black mana was spent to cast the spell, put the top 4 cards of your library into your graveyard. So it mills you, which is good. You know, that's a good dual purpose. It's obviously not as strong as giving something haste, but and then after that, assuming you paid the adamant cost, which you're not always going to pay the adamant cost. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. 3 black can be tricky sometimes, but then you choose a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, return it to the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter. The +1/+1's kind of, I don't want to say irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, but it's really not. It's not great, you know. Making an Ulamog an 11/11, it's not really a huge difference. Or making Drakuseth an 8/8, it's not really a huge difference. If you can reanimate them early enough, the idea of Ulamog being indestructible and a 10/10 that mills them for 20 every time he attacks is a lot more, you know, impactful. If you put a +1/+1 counter on that, it's not really fantastic, but I mean, it's something. And then we have our 2 reanimator targets, which I talked about a little bit already. Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, which he's 7 mana, 3 of which are red. He's a legendary creature dragon with flying. He's a 7/7. And whenever he attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and 3 damage to up to 2 other targets. So basically, when he comes crashing in, he can more or less wipe their board and do a bunch of damage to them. So obviously with Bond of Revival, this is very, very strong. And then Ulamog, which we talked about already. Yeah, he comes back. He's really hard to deal with, and he will end the game pretty quickly. The land setup's pretty standard. 4 Blood Crypt, 4 Dragon Skull Summit. I might go down to 3 Dragon Skull Summit, but I don't know. We'll have to see how it works out. I'm running 3 Fabled Passages, and then just swamps and mountains. That's basically the deck. Let me know what you think. I'll have a link to this Aether Hub below the video. Yeah, let me know what you think, how it goes for you. If you like this deck and you like my other ones, please like and then subscribe if you want. Thanks.